The heavy mahogany doors of the city's most exclusive, heavily guarded restaurant swung open, but it wasn't a rival boss or an assassin who walked in. It was a 6-year-old girl in a frayed pink coat, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. The room froze. The deadliest men in the syndicate reached for their weapons, but the little girl marched straight up to the ruthless head of the family, held out an old photograph, and whispered 5 words that would tear his criminal empire apart. The air inside La Bella Noti was thick with the scent of rich marinara, expensive imported cigars, and the unspoken tension that always accompanied the presence of Vincent Moretti. To the outside world, Vincent was a reclusive businessman, a real estate mogul who owned half the commercial properties in the city. To the underground, he was the undisputed king of the concrete jungle, a man whose whispered name could empty a room faster than a drawn gun. He sat at the head of a long, white-clothed table in the private back room, the dim amber lighting casting harsh shadows across his sharp, unforgiving features. On either side of him sat his most trusted inner circle. Dominic Russo, his underboss, leaned back in his chair, swirling amber liquid in a crystal glass. At the door stood Enzo, a mountain of a man whose tailored suit barely contained his bulk. They were currently discussing a dispute at the docks, a tedious affair regarding a stolen shipment that Vincent was losing patience with. If the crew down at Pier 40 can't manage a simple import schedule without skimming off the top, Vincent said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded absolute silence. Then we replace the crew, all of them. Send a message that incompetence is indistinguishable from treason. Dominic nodded, taking a sip of his drink. Consider it done, boss. Before the conversation could shift to the escalating tensions with the Bianchi family, a rival syndicate encroaching on their southern territories, a heavy thud echoed from the main dining room. The private quarters were supposed to be completely locked down. No one entered without a thorough search and Enzo's explicit permission. Enzo instantly dropped his hand to the holster beneath his jacket, his eyes darting to the frosted glass of the double doors. Dominic sat up straight, the casual demeanor vanishing in a heartbeat, replaced by the predatory instinct of a street-hardened enforcer. Vincent merely steepled his fingers, his cold, dark eyes fixed on the entrance. He did not reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. The heavy oak doors creaked open slowly, agonizingly, as if the person on the other side lacked the physical strength to push them. The men in the room braced for an ambush. What stepped through the threshold, however, made the air completely vanish from the room. It was a child. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She wore a faded, dirty pink winter coat that was 2 sizes too big for her, the sleeves rolled up at the wrists. Her dark hair was tangled, her face smudged with city soot and what looked like dried tears. She looked terrifyingly out of place among the velvet upholstery and the armed killers. Her small, scuffed sneakers squeaked against the polished hardwood floor. For a long, surreal second, absolute silence reigned. Even the hardened mafia enforcers were paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the situation. How had a child bypassed 4 layers of armed security? "What the hell is this?" Dominic whispered, breaking the silence, his hand slowly falling away from his jacket. Enzo took a heavy step forward, his massive frame towering over the small girl. "Hey, kid, you can't be in here. How did you get past the kitchen?" The little girl didn't look at Enzo. She didn't look at Dominic. Her wide, piercing green eyes locked directly onto Vincent Moretti at the head of the table. She possessed a strange, unsettling focus, an unyielding determination that mirrored the hardened criminal surrounding her. She bypassed Enzo entirely, ducking under his massive outstretched arm with surprising agility, and marched straight toward Vincent. "Hey!" Enzo barked, turning to grab her collar. "Leave her," Vincent commanded. The order was quiet, but it cracked through the room like a whip. Enzo froze instantly, taking a step back and bowing his head. The other men at the table remained perfectly still as the child stopped just 2 feet away from Vincent's chair. Vincent studied her. He had ordered men to their ends without blinking. He had watched empires crumble. But looking down at this tiny, shivering girl, a strange, inexplicable chill washed over him. There was something profoundly familiar about the shape of her jaw, the defiant tilt of her chin, and those vivid green eyes. She reached into the pocket of her oversized coat and pulled out a small, crumpled square of paper. Her hands were shaking, but she held it out toward him with a steady, unyielding grip. "I'm looking for my daddy," she said. Her voice was small, but it did not waver. Vincent stared at the girl, his face an impenetrable mask of stone. The men around the table exchanged bewildered, nervous glances. No one dared to breathe, let alone speak. To claim to be the child of Vincent Moretti was an impossibility. He had no heirs. He had made sure of it. Attachments were liabilities, weaknesses that enemies could exploit. He had learned that lesson the hardest way imaginable 7 years ago. Slowly, deliberately, Vincent extended a large calloused hand and took the crumpled piece of paper from the girl's trembling fingers. It was an old Polaroid photograph, its edges frayed and white, the glossy finish marred by deep creases, as if it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. Vincent turned it over. The moment his eyes registered the image on the photo, all the air left his lungs. A physical blow to the chest would have done less damage. The background of the photo was a rustic cabin surrounded by autumn trees, a safe house in upstate New York. In the foreground stood 2 people. One was a younger man, his face lacking the harsh, unforgiving lines it bore today, his eyes bright, a genuine smile playing on his lips. It was Vincent, back when he was just a lieutenant, back when he believed he could balance the life of the syndicate with a life of his own. Beside him in the photograph, leaning into his chest with her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, was Natalia. Natalia Rossi. She was looking up at the camera, her dark hair blowing across her face, her brilliant green eyes sparkling with laughter. Vincent's vision blurred. The noise of the city outside, the hum of the restaurant's ventilation, the very presence of his men faded into a distant, muted drone. Suddenly, it was 7 years ago. He was back on that rain-slicked street in Brooklyn. He could smell the burning rubber and gasoline. He could feel the heat of the explosion that had consumed the car Natalia had just stepped into. He remembered the blinding flash of light, the deafening roar, the agonizing screams. He had watched the love of his life, the only woman who had ever looked past the monster, to see the man turn to ash in a fiery assassination attempt orchestrated by a rival boss he had subsequently hunted down and dismantled piece by piece. He had buried an empty casket. He had buried his heart right next to it. Since that day he had been a ghost, a machine built only for power and retribution. But here standing in front of him was a little girl with Natalia's green eyes, holding a picture that he had taken with her just 2 months before the explosion, 2 months before she died. Vincent swallowed hard, his throat tight, his mouth suddenly completely dry. He looked slowly from the photograph to the little girl. The resemblance, which had seemed mildly familiar a moment ago, was now blindingly obvious. It was like looking at a ghost. "What is your name?" Vincent asked. His voice was raw, a hollow rasp that made Dominic flinch. It was a tone the underboss had never heard from the stoic leader. "Sophie," the little girl answered, her green eyes locked onto his dark ones. "Sophie." Natalia had always loved that name. They used to lie awake in the safe house, talking about the impossible future, throwing around names for children they promised to have, once they found a way out of the life. Vincent did the math in his head. The explosion was 7 years ago. Sophie looked to be about 6. It was medically possible. It was logically impossible, but the timeline fit perfectly. If Natalia had survived the blast, if she had somehow crawled out of the wreckage before the flames consumed it, if she had run away to protect the unborn child, she knew Vincent's enemies would never stop hunting. "Where did you get this, Sophie?" Vincent asked, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees to bring himself closer to her eye level. He was entirely unaware of the shocked stares of his top lieutenants, The ruthless mafia boss was gone. In his place was a shattered man looking at a miracle he didn't dare believe in. My mommy gave it to me, Sophie said softly. She told me to keep it hidden. She said if we were ever in terrible trouble and if she couldn't protect me anymore, I had to run. I had to run to the city and show this picture to the men in the dark suits. She said they would take me to the man in the picture. Vincent closed his eyes. The pain in his chest was excruciating, a mixture of profound betrayal, staggering grief, and a sudden violent spark of hope. She was alive. Natalia was alive. She had lived out there in the world for 7 years, raising their daughter in the shadows, hiding from his enemies and hiding from him. Is she Natalia? Vincent choked out the name, tasting like ash and honey on his tongue. Sophie nodded slowly. Yes. Vincent opened his eyes, the spark of hope igniting into a roaring inferno. He looked at Dominic, who was staring back with equal parts confusion and alarm. Dominic. Vincent said, his voice regaining its dangerous commanding edge. Clear the room, now. Boss, I said clear the damn room. Vincent roared, slamming his fist onto the table, the crystal glasses rattling violently. The men scrambled. Chairs screeched against the floors. Enzo, Dominic, and the other lieutenants rushed out, pulling the heavy oak doors shut behind them, leaving Vincent alone in the dim room with the little girl who held his entire world in her small, dirty hands. Once the doors clicked shut, the oppressive silence returned, broken only by the sound of Vincent's heavy breathing. He looked at Sophie, really looked at her. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the dirt under her fingernails, the way she clutched her coat tightly around herself, as if trying to shrink into nothingness. She was terrified, pushing through her fear with a desperate learned bravery. Vincent reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a clean white silk handkerchief. He offered it to her. She looked at it warily for a moment before taking it, wiping the soot from her cheek. Sophie. Vincent said, softening his voice to a gentle murmur, terrified that a sudden movement might shatter the illusion and wake him from this fevered dream. You said your mother told you to find me if you were in terrible trouble. What kind of trouble? Sophie's lower lip trembled. The brave facade she had maintained since she walked through the doors finally began to crack. Tears welled up in her striking green eyes, spilling over her dark lashes. The bad men. She sobbed, her small shoulders heaving. They broke our door. It was late. Mommy hid me in the floorboards. She has a secret place under the rug. She pushed me in and told me not to make a sound no matter what I heard. Vincent's blood turned to ice. He knew the protocol. He had taught Natalia how to build a hide hole in every apartment they had ever shared. He had drilled into her head the necessity of an emergency exit. The fact that she had used it meant her location had been compromised. What did you hear, little one? Vincent asked, his hands balling into fists on his knees. I heard shouting, Sophie cried, wiping her nose with the silk handkerchief. Mommy was fighting them. There was a loud bang, like thunder in the living room, and then Mommy stopped fighting. I heard the men talking. They laughed. They said they finally found the ghost. Vincent's jaw tightened so hard his teeth ground together. The ghost. That was the street moniker given to the mystery woman who had supposedly died in the Moretti car bomb. Rumors had circulated for years that a body was never fully recovered, but Vincent had dismissed them as the cruel gossip of a paranoid underworld. Someone else hadn't dismissed it. Someone had kept looking. Did you see the men, Sophie? Did you look through the cracks? Sophie nodded, sniffing loudly. I saw boots, big black boots. And when one of the men knelt down to pick up Mommy, I saw his arm. His sleeve was rolled up. Did he have a picture on his skin? Vincent pressed his voice taut like a piano wire ready to snap. Yes, Sophie whispered, her eyes widening with the remembered terror. It was a big, ugly snake, a green snake wrapping around a knife. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Vincent stood up slowly, his imposing figure casting a long, dark shadow over the table. The green snake entwined around a dagger. It was the crest of the Bianchi family, Carmine Bianchi, the vicious new head of the rival syndicate, had been pushing his boundaries for months, testing Vincent's patience, probing for weaknesses. They hadn't just found a weakness. They had found his heart. If the Bianchis had Natalia, they wouldn't kill her immediately. Carmine Bianchi was sadistic, but he was also a calculated businessman. He would use her. He would use her to ransom territories, to force Vincent to his knees, and then only when he had extracted everything of value would he execute her to break the Moretti family spirit. "Sophie," Vincent said, stepping around the table and crouching down in front of her. He placed his large, warm hands on her tiny shoulders. "Listen to me very carefully. You are safe now. No one will ever hurt you again. Do you understand me? You are in my house and nobody touches what belongs to me." Sophie looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes searching his face. "Are you really my daddy?" Vincent swallowed the massive lump in his throat. He reached up and gently brushed a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. "I am. I didn't know you were out there, Sophie. If I had known, I would have burned the whole world down to find you. But I know now." "Can you save my mommy?" she asked, her voice cracking with desperate, innocent hope. "Can you stop the men with the snakes?" Vincent's eyes darkened, a cold, merciless fire igniting within them. The ghost of the man who loved Natalia had resurrected, but the ruthless monster who ran the city was still very much alive, and the two halves were rapidly merging into a terrifying force of absolute vengeance. "I'm not just going to stop them," Vincent whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, lethal promise. "I'm going to erase them." He stood up and turned toward the door. "Dominic," he roared. The oak doors immediately swung open. Dominic and Enzo stepped inside, their faces pale, unsure of what they were walking back into. They saw Vincent standing tall, his eyes burning with a terrifying, unholy fury they hadn't seen in 7 long years. "Call the captains!" Vincent ordered, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "All of them. Empty the armories. I want every single man we have on the streets within the hour. Lock down the southern borders. Nothing goes in or out of Bianchi territory without my say-so." Dominic's eyes widened in shock. "Boss, that's a declaration of all-out war. The commission will step in. The streets will bleed." "Let them bleed," Vincent snarled, walking past his underboss and grabbing his heavy black overcoat from the coat rack. He slipped it on, checking the loaded handgun holstered at his side. He turned back to his men, his expression absolute zero. "Carmine Bianchi took something from me tonight." Vincent said, his gaze shifting briefly to the little girl standing near the table clutching the silk handkerchief. "And before the sun comes up, I am going to tear his heart out of his chest to get it back." The heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant snapped shut, plunging the dining room into a suffocating tension. Vincent Moretti moved with the lethal precision of an apex predator. He handed his overcoat to Dominic, his face pale but resolute. His mind, usually a fortress of cold logic, was a tempest of rage and desperate hope. He knelt beside Enzo, his massive bodyguard, who awkwardly held the tiny, trembling hand of Sophie. The contrast between the giant enforcer and the fragile child was stark. But Enzo looked at the girl with a fierce, protective gentleness that surprised even the hardened Vincent. "Unnen Enzo." Vincent ordered, his voice a gravelly rumble that commanded absolute obedience. "Take Sophie to the penthouse at the Grand Plaza. Use the private underground elevator. You do not leave her side for a single second. You do not let anyone in unless it is me or Dominic. If anyone tries to stop you, you put a bullet in their skull. Do you understand me?" Enzo nodded solemnly, his jaw tight. "With my life, boss." Vincent touched his daughter's cheek, wiping away a stray tear. "Be brave. Little one, I will bring your mother home. I promise you right now." As Enzo led the child away through the secure rear exit, Vincent stood up, his demeanor instantly transforming from a tender father to the ruthless king of the underworld. Dominic approached, holding out a secure satellite phone. "The captains are on the line, boss. The armories in the East End and the Harbor District are already being emptied. We have 80 men heavily armed and ready to move within the next 10 minutes. But we need a target. Carmine Bianchi has dozens of fronts across the city. Where exactly do we strike first? Vincent snatched the encrypted satellite phone. We do not strike blindly, Vincent snarled. We cut off the head of the snake. Carmine uses the old slaughterhouse on 10th Avenue to launder his cash and interrogate his rivals. If he took Natalia, he would want her somewhere he feels completely in control. Somewhere his top enforcers are heavily stationed. Dominic nodded, signaling the men to gear up. The slaughterhouse is a heavily guarded fortress, Vincent. It has reinforced steel doors and a dozen armed guards on the perimeter. It will be a bloodbath. Vincent racked the slide of his dark custom pistol, then let it be a bloodbath. They brought this war to my doorstep the moment they laid hands on my family. Tell the assault teams to equip for heavy breaching. We go in hard, and we leave no survivors. The convoy of sleek black SUVs tore through the rain-slicked streets of the city, ignoring red lights and speed limits. The fierce storm outside perfectly mirrored the absolute fury raging inside Vincent's chest. The city blurred past the dark-tinted windows, a chaotic smear of neon lights and shadows. In the lead vehicle, Vincent sat in silence, meticulously loading extra magazines into his heavy tactical vest. The memory of the terrible explosion 7 years ago flashed through his mind, the blinding orange fireball, the deafening roar, the agonizing scent of burning metal. He had spent years hunting down the men responsible, dismantling their lives piece by piece, but the hollow void in his soul had never been filled. Now, knowing that Natalia had survived, that she had spent 7 years hiding in absolute fear to protect their daughter from his enemies, a new, far more dangerous anger completely consumed him. He would not fail her again. He would tear Carmine Bianchi apart with his bare hands. The convoy screeched to a sudden halt 3 blocks away from the slaughterhouse. The rain was coming down in thick sheets. Dominic turned from the passenger seat. We are in position, boss. The scouts report 4 heavily armed guards at the loading docks and 2 on the roof. Infrared scanners show at least 20 heat signatures inside the main building. Vincent stepped out the icy rain, instantly soaking his tailored suit. He pulled his assault rifle from the trunk, the cold steel physically grounding him. Silencers on, Vincent ordered over the secure comms channel. We breach the loading dock now. The tactical assault was a terrifying masterclass in organized brutality. Vincent's men moved like lethal shadows through the pouring rain. 4 synchronized silent shots rang out barely audible over the raging storm, and the 4 guards at the loading dock dropped without a single sound. The roof guards were neutralized seconds later by a skilled sniper. Vincent advanced rapidly, his eyes locked on the heavy corrugated steel doors. Dominic planted a shaped breaching charge on the locking mechanism, stepped back, and hit the remote detonator. The massive explosion was extremely deafening, completely blowing the heavy steel doors clean away outside. Go, go, go! Dominic shouted loudly, leading the charge as Vincent's men swarmed into the dark building, tactical flashlights cutting through the heavy gloom. The slaughterhouse smelled strongly of bleach-rusted iron and old blood. The Bianchi enforcers inside were caught completely off guard. A chaotic, desperate firefight erupted instantly. Muzzle flashes brightly illuminated the dark warehouse like strobe lights, accompanied by the deafening roar of automatic weapons. Vincent moved through the violent chaos with terrifying efficiency. He did not duck. He walked forward like a completely relentless force of pure nature, his rifle immediately taking down 2 tattooed men. Clear the catwalks! Vincent yelled smoothly, slamming a fresh magazine home. Dominic lobbed a heavy flashbang grenade onto the upper metal catwalk. The blinding white light disoriented the snipers, allowing Vincent's men to pick them off with ruthless precision. Within 3 minutes, the entire main floor was completely secured. Groans of the wounded echoed, but Vincent ignored them entirely. He spotted a terrified man desperately trying to crawl away. It was Lorenzo, one of Carmine's trusted lieutenants. Vincent drew his pistol rapidly, pinning the struggling man to the bloody floor, with a very heavy, unyielding boot to his weak back. Lorenzo gasped in terrible pain. "I do not know what you are talking about, Moretti. The commission will definitely demand your head for this unprovoked attack." Vincent did not hesitate for a single microsecond. He shifted his aim slightly and fired a single deafening shot directly into Lorenzo's right kneecap. The scream echoed horribly throughout the cavernous building. Lorenzo thrashed wildly in agony. "I am not going to ask you again, Lorenzo," Vincent whispered coldly. "Carmine forcefully took Natalia Rossi tonight. Tell me exactly where he is currently holding her, or my absolute next bullet permanently shatters your lower spine." Lorenzo sobbed uncontrollably, his foolish defiance entirely broken. The old shipyard, Pier 82. Carmine has a large private luxury yacht docked there securely. He took her there exactly an hour ago. Please, I swear on my life. Vincent lifted his heavy boot and turned away, his face a terrifying mask of concentrated murderous fury. "Dominic!" Vincent barked loudly, striding swiftly back toward the destroyed loading dock. "Burn this entire miserable place straight to the ground. Leave absolutely no trace behind. Then immediately get the men to Pier 82. We are going straight to the deep water tonight to finish this." Dominic nodded affirmatively, pulling a heavy incendiary grenade from his tactical combat harness. "You heard the boss," Dominic yelled forcefully to the assembled crew. "Torch the entire building now." As Vincent walked briskly out into the pouring icy rain, the extremely bright orange glow of devastating flames forcefully erupted behind him, dramatically casting long, aggressively dancing shadows against the wet pavement. The slaughterhouse was burning fiercely, but the furious, unyielding fire burning deep inside Vincent's dark, tortured soul was far hotter, and it absolutely would not be quenched until Carmine Bianchi was entirely reduced to useless blood-soaked white ashes. The drive to Pier 82 felt like an absolute eternity. The severe storm had intensely escalated rapidly, transforming the dark city streets into rushing rivers of deep black water. Vincent's highly skilled driver violently pushed the heavily armored SUV to its absolute mechanical limits, dangerously hydroplaning through incredibly tight corners and roaring loudly down completely abandoned industrial avenues. Vincent sat entirely motionless in the spacious back seat, his extremely cold, dark eyes fixed completely unblinkingly on the desolate rain-swept urban landscape of the harsh harbor district. The massive towering metal cranes of the dark shipyard loomed menacingly ahead now. Every passing second felt remarkably like a tremendous physical weight pressing violently down upon his broad chest. 7 agonizing years he had faithfully mourned her. 7 long years he had miserably lived as a completely hollowed-out empty shell, merely existing only to efficiently manage a vast criminal empire he deeply despised. And now, the beautiful woman who had always held his heavily guarded heart, the brave mother of the sweet daughter he had literally just met tonight, was unfortunately currently suffering in the deeply twisted hands of a completely sadistic, unpredictable psychopath. He absolutely needed to hurry up now. "We are finally approaching Pier 82, Dominic stated firmly from the front passenger seat, his gruff voice noticeably tight with intense anticipation. Our forward scouts nervously report a heavily fortified presence. Carmine's private luxury yacht is currently docked securely at the far end of the long concrete pier. There are strictly at least 30 heavily armed men aggressively patrolling the slippery docks, and several hidden snipers cleverly positioned atop the surrounding metal cargo containers. It literally is a highly dangerous, extremely well-defended military fortress, heavily floating directly on the rough, dark water tonight. Vincent checked his heavy weapons. "Hootie. We simply do not have enough precious time for a quiet, stealth approach tonight," Vincent loudly declared. Carmine already surely knows we forcefully hit the old slaughterhouse. He absolutely knows I am rapidly coming for him right now. He will desperately try to use Natalia as powerful leverage, or even worse, he will cowardly try to quickly slip away safely by sea. Vincent's strong jaw tightened aggressively. We must trap them completely. Quickly block the main pier entrance with the heavy armored trucks. Send a stealth team to rapidly cut the thick mooring lines so that massive ship absolutely stays. The heavy convoy arrived violently at the completely dark shipyard, aggressively tearing through the flimsy chained gates without ever slowing down once. The loud screech of burning tires and the deafening roar of powerful engines immediately alerted the extremely nervous Bianchi guards instantly. Bright security spotlights suddenly snapped on everywhere, easily cutting through the heavy, blinding rain and clearly illuminating the massive black SUVs as they aggressively skidded to a chaotic halt, quickly forming an impenetrable defensive barricade entirely blocking the long concrete pier. The humid air violently erupted instantly with the incredibly deafening, terrifying sound of heavy machine guns. Lethal bullets constantly sparked extremely brightly off the heavily reinforced thick metal armor of the sturdy SUVs, completely shattering safety glass and aggressively tearing deeply into the strong metal frames. Vincent immediately kicked open his heavy door and quickly dove safely behind the massive engine block, instantly returning lethal fire with his powerful assault rifle. The brutal, unforgiving battle for control of Pier 82 had officially begun now, and it quickly became an incredibly chaotic, extraordinarily bloody, completely terrifying, absolute nightmare for everyone involved. Suppressing heavy fire directly on those tall containers, Vincent roared extremely loudly over the deafening noise. Dominic and his dedicated heavy weapons tactical team immediately unleashed a completely relentless, totally devastating heavy barrage of extremely high-caliber suppressive fire, rapidly chewing directly through the incredibly thin, weak metal walls of the tall shipping containers, permanently silencing the hidden enemy snipers in a completely brutal, absolutely unforgiving hail of hot flying lead. With the crucial high ground completely neutralized now, Vincent fearlessly led the extremely violent, bloody forward charge directly down the highly exposed, incredibly dangerous open concrete pier toward the large floating ship. The relentless freezing rain battered the long concrete expanse of Pier 82, turning the entire surface into a treacherously slick mirror-like battlefield, perfectly reflecting the aggressive strobing muzzle flashes of heavy automatic weapons. Vincent Moretti moved with the terrifying, unstoppable momentum of a derailed freight train, his tailored dark suit entirely soaked through with freezing harbor water and the fresh warm blood of the rival men he had already dispatched. He smoothly reloaded his heavy assault rifle on the move, his completely empty spent magazine clattering loudly against the hard, wet ground, just as he sharply pivoted around a rusted, massive metal shipping container. Two heavily tattooed Bianchi enforcers foolishly stepped out from the deep shadows, blindly raising their tactical shotguns. Vincent did not even break his measured predatory stride. He raised his heavy weapon and fired two precise, lethal bursts, dropping both men instantly onto the flooded, blood-stained concrete before they could even fully disengage their weapon safeties. "Keep pushing them backward!" Vincent roared forcefully into the heavy, chaotic storm, his deep, commanding voice effortlessly cutting through the deafening roar of continuous gunfire and the violent, crashing harbor waves. Do not give them a single inch of breathing room. Force them entirely onto the yacht. Dominic, running low and fast to Vincent's left, hurled another heavy fragmentation grenade directly toward a makeshift barricade of wooden shipping crates that three desperate Bianchi guards were hopelessly using for sparse cover. The incredibly violent, deafening explosion ripped the wooden crates into 1,000 jagged, lethal splinters, completely clearing the immediate path to the massive, brilliantly illuminated luxury vessel, bobbing violently on the dark, choppy water at the very end of the long pier. The impressive, sleek white yacht, aggressively named the Serpent's Pride, was currently heavily tethered to the massive iron dock cleats by thick braided nylon mooring lines. Vincent's dedicated stealth operatives had already successfully managed to covertly sever the stern lines, but the heavy bowline was still securely attached, preventing the terrified Bianchi crew from rapidly fleeing out into the deep, dark ocean. As Vincent aggressively approached the lowered boarding ramp, a concentrated lethal hail of suppressive machine gun fire violently erupted from the yacht's elevated upper deck, aggressively pinning Vincent and his highly trained assault team down behind a low, thick concrete retaining wall. "We need covering fire right now, boss!" Dominic shouted loudly over the incredibly deafening noise, aggressively wiping a mixture of freezing rain and gritty concrete dust from his deeply lined, battle-hardened face. "That heavy gunner on the upper balcony has us completely pinned down perfectly. We cannot possibly cross that exposed boarding ramp without getting entirely shredded into tiny, unrecognizable pieces." Vincent's dark, merciless eyes rapidly scanned the incredibly chaotic, violently illuminated tactical environment. He noticed a massive, heavy industrial crane towering ominously over the dark dock, its thick steel cable dangling a massive empty shipping container directly above the yacht's unprotected upper deck. "Dominic!" Vincent yelled loudly, violently pointing a blood-soaked finger toward the tall crane's poorly guarded control cabin. "Get up there right now. Drop that massive container directly onto that upper deck, crush that miserable gunner, and completely shatter their upper defenses." Dominic grinned fiercely, a terrifying, predatory expression that perfectly matched his boss's completely unhinged, violent fury. "Consider it done, Vincent." Without another word, Dominic rapidly broke from the protective cover, desperately sprinting wildly through the freezing torrential downpour toward the tall metal ladder of the heavy industrial crane, while Vincent and the remaining men aggressively laid down a completely blinding, overwhelming wall of heavy suppressive fire to cover his highly dangerous, totally exposed tactical movement. The agonizing seconds felt like incredibly long, painful hours. The Bianchi heavy gunner desperately shifted his lethal focus, frantically trying to track Dominic's rapid, evasive sprint, but Vincent aggressively leaned completely out of cover, violently firing his heavy assault rifle until the heavy barrel practically glowed a bright, searing cherry red in the freezing rain. Suddenly, with a deafening, terrifying screech of agonizing, unlubricated metal gears and a violent shudder of heavy machinery, the massive towering crane abruptly lurched into sudden violent motion. The gigantic heavy steel shipping container swung wildly through the stormy, chaotic night air, desperately guided by Dominic from the high control cabin. With a completely terrifying, earth-shattering crash that violently echoed across the entire dark harbor, the heavy metal container brutally slammed directly down onto the yacht's fragile upper deck. The incredibly violent impact completely obliterated the heavy machine gun nest, instantly violently shattering expensive reinforced glass and completely crushing the elegant upper superstructure into a tangled, smoking ruin of twisted, sparking metal. The yacht violently pitched sideways in the dark, churning water, throwing the remaining terrified Bianchi defenders violently off their feet. "Move now." Vincent bellowed loudly, instantly leaping over the low concrete wall and aggressively charging directly up the steep, slippery boarding ramp like a completely unstoppable, heavily armed demon, entirely fueled by absolute unyielding rage and profound, desperate love. He aggressively breached the main cabin's heavy shattered glass doors, his heavy combat boots crunching loudly on the incredibly expensive, completely ruined crystal chandeliers that had violently fallen onto the plush, heavily blood-stained white carpets. The luxurious interior of the Serpent's Pride was a completely chaotic, terrifying nightmare of violent close-quarters combat. The remaining Bianchi loyalists fought back with the crazed, desperate ferocity of trapped, terrified rats. But they were absolutely no match whatsoever for Vincent's incredibly cold, completely calculated, and utterly terrifying lethal precision. He moved methodically, almost elegantly, through the long, lavish corridors, completely clearing each opulent room with ruthlessly efficient, deadly bursts of heavy, suppressed gunfire. He was desperately searching for one specific thing. He was completely ignoring the massive, heavily stacked piles of illicit bundled cash, the glittering, highly illegal narcotics, and the incredibly expensive, priceless stolen artwork indiscriminately scattered everywhere. He solely wanted the absolutely hidden, deeply buried holding cell where the incredibly cruel, completely sadistic Carmine Bianchi was currently keeping the one beautiful, innocent woman who completely owned Vincent's deeply scarred, incredibly heavy heart. He absolutely knew he was getting dangerously close when he finally reached a heavily reinforced, highly secure steel door, completely guarded by 4 of Carmine's largest, most highly decorated elite personal enforcers. The extremely narrow, dimly lit lower hallway of the yacht provided absolutely zero cover for anyone. It was a complete, deadly, unavoidable choke point, exactly as the incredibly paranoid, heavily guarded Carmine Bianchi had carefully designed it. The 4 massive, heavily armed elite guards immediately raised their customized, highly lethal submachine guns. The absolute second Vincent's tall, imposing, dark figure aggressively rounded the tight corner. But Vincent was incredibly significantly faster, his deeply ingrained lethal tactical instincts completely taking over his exhausted, heavily battered physical body. He rapidly dropped sharply to one knee, sliding aggressively across the incredibly slick, highly polished mahogany floorboards, violently firing his heavy weapon with absolutely perfect, terrifyingly lethal accuracy. 2 of the massive guards dropped instantly, their heavily tattooed large heads violently snapping backward. Vincent smoothly rolled aggressively to his left, completely avoiding a deadly concentrated hail of return fire that violently shredded the incredibly expensive, highly detailed silk wallpaper directly behind him. He swiftly drew his heavy, customized dark pistol from his tactical hip holster with his left hand, while simultaneously firing his primary rifle with his right hand, a completely masterful, incredibly terrifying display of absolute lethal violence. The 3rd guard awkwardly fell heavily forward, desperately clutching a completely shattered, heavily bleeding collarbone, while the 4th and final massive guard desperately tried to violently charge Vincent directly with a drawn, incredibly sharp tactical combat knife. Vincent simply stood up slowly, entirely unfazed by the sudden violent charge, and coldly, precisely shot the desperate man exactly once, squarely in the center of his chest. The heavy, lifeless body collapsed loudly right at Vincent's soaking wet, heavily blood-stained combat boots. The hallway was now completely, utterly silent, except for the extremely heavy, entirely ragged sound of Vincent's own incredibly rapid, deep breathing, and the muffled, completely terrifying sound of a very familiar, deeply loved voice desperately screaming loudly from the other side of the heavy, reinforced steel door. It was Natalia. The incredibly frantic, deeply terrified sound of her beautiful voice violently drove a completely massive, invisible, ice-cold spike directly through Vincent's incredibly dark, deeply tortured soul. He rapidly stepped up to the heavy door, quickly aiming his heavy weapon at the complex, high-tech electronic locking mechanism, and aggressively fired 3 heavy armor-piercing rounds directly into the expensive control panel. The heavy steel door violently hissed loudly and slowly swung open. Vincent immediately kicked it fully wide open, rapidly raising his heavy weapon, his dark eyes frantically scanning the incredibly bright, highly sterile interior of the hidden panic room. Carmine Bianchi was standing directly in the center of the small, heavily armored room. He was a surprisingly small, deeply rat-like, terribly ugly man, wearing an incredibly expensive, completely ruined white silk suit. In his trembling, heavily manicured right hand, he held a highly polished, incredibly sharp silver revolver. His left arm was completely violently wrapped tightly around the incredibly slender, highly fragile neck of Natalia Rossi. Vincent's entire world abruptly completely stopped spinning. Natalia looked incredibly beautiful, even deeply covered in dark, terrible bruises and heavily exhausted by absolute, unyielding terror. Her completely striking, incredibly vibrant green eyes, the absolute, exact, same incredibly beautiful green eyes that deeply mirrored little Sophie's innocent, entirely trusting gaze, were heavily widened in absolute complete shock as she stared directly at Vincent. She had not seen him in exactly 7 incredibly long, terribly painful years. To her, he was supposed to be completely moving on, totally unaware of her continued, highly secret existence. But here, he finally was an incredibly violent, totally blood-soaked, heavily armed, avenging angel, deeply emerging from the very worst, most terrifying depths of total, absolute hell just to desperately save her. "Drop the weapon! Vincent!" Carmine shrieked loudly, his high-pitched, terribly annoying voice completely cracking with intense, absolute panic. He violently pressed the incredibly cold, entirely unforgiving silver barrel of his revolver directly against Natalia's heavily bruised, deeply trembling right temple. "Drop the damn gun right now, or I swear to God I will completely blow her beautiful lying head entirely off her pretty shoulders." Vincent did not move a single microscopic inch. He kept his heavy weapon perfectly completely leveled directly at Carmine's deeply sweating, terribly ugly forehead. "If you even accidentally pull that trigger, Carmine," Vincent whispered incredibly softly, his terrifying, deeply rumbling voice heavily carrying a completely absolute, totally inescapable promise of total endless agony. "I will not simply kill you. I will keep you completely agonizingly alive for exactly 10 long, terrible years. I will completely remove every single piece of your miserable skin with a terribly dull, heavily rusted spoon. Let her go right now." "You are completely bluffing, Moretti." Carmine desperately screamed violently, tightening his heavy, suffocating grip on Natalia's slender neck. "You heavily lost her once. You are completely, absolutely terrified of losing her again. Put the gun down." Natalia slowly, desperately met Vincent's dark, completely unwavering eyes. In that tiny, microscopic fraction of a fleeting second, an incredibly deep, entirely unspoken, highly profound volume of absolute perfect understanding rapidly passed directly between them. She completely remembered exactly who she was dealing with. She suddenly violently stomped her heavy incredibly sharp leather heel directly down onto Carmine's expensive Italian leather shoe with absolutely every single ounce of desperate, terrified strength she currently possessed. Carmine howled loudly in sudden, totally unexpected physical agony, his grip completely involuntarily loosening for exactly 1/2 of a highly crucial second. That incredibly tiny microscopic window was absolutely more than enough. Vincent fired exactly one single perfectly placed, incredibly loud shot. The heavy, lethal bullet cleanly, perfectly, completely bypassed Natalia's violently dodging head, entirely aggressively striking Carmine Bianchi absolutely directly, perfectly, squarely right between his deeply terrified, incredibly wide, terribly ugly eyes. The sadistic rival mafia boss violently collapsed backward, immediately completely dead, absolutely before his incredibly expensive, totally ruined silk suit even heavily hit the highly polished, completely sterile metal floor. Natalia aggressively stumbled completely forward, deeply, gasping violently for necessary air, completely shaking uncontrollably. Vincent instantly aggressively threw his heavy, completely empty assault rifle completely aside and rapidly rushed directly forward, violently catching her fragile, completely exhausted body deeply in his strong, incredibly protective, heavily tattooed arms before she could even heavily hit the floor. "Vincent!" She violently sobbed loudly, violently burying her heavily bruised, deeply tear-stained face completely into his entirely soaked, heavily blood-stained dark chest. "You completely found me. You actually finally found me." "I found you completely," Vincent whispered incredibly softly, entirely burying his tired, deeply scarred face heavily into her incredibly dark, completely tangled hair, entirely breathing in her absolutely familiar, deeply missed scent. "Sophie is completely safe. She is entirely safe with Enzo. I promised our sweet daughter I would absolutely bring you completely home, Natalia." "We heavily need to completely leave," Dominic rapidly interrupted, loudly, violently rushing completely into the highly secure panic room, his heavy combat breathing entirely ragged. "The yacht is violently sinking fast. The massive crane strike completely heavily breached the lower hull. We have exactly 2 short minutes before this entire miserable vessel goes entirely down to the completely dark, freezing bottom." Vincent rapidly scooped Natalia entirely up into his strong, highly protective arms, completely effortlessly carrying her completely, like she absolutely weighed nothing at all. "Let it completely sink, Dominic," Vincent loudly declared, heavily, striding rapidly completely out of the totally ruined panic room without ever heavily looking deeply back at Carmine's lifeless, completely pathetic body. "Our highly necessary, deeply important work here is entirely, completely, totally done tonight." They rapidly escaped the completely, violently sinking luxury yacht exactly as the incredibly dark, completely freezing harbor waters forcefully rushed violently over the highly shattered main deck. As they safely, heavily reached the fully secured, incredibly heavily armored dark SUVs, deeply waiting entirely patiently on the heavily rain-swept, completely blood-stained pier, Vincent softly, gently placed Natalia deeply into the incredibly warm, entirely safe back seat. He looked entirely up at the highly stormy, deeply dark city skyline. The completely terrible, highly dangerous, absolutely deadly war was finally entirely over. The incredibly beautiful, completely resilient Ghost had finally, completely, gloriously resurrected. And the incredibly ruthless, deeply feared Mafia Boss was finally entirely, completely, totally whole once again. The heavy armored black SUV tore relentlessly through the flooded, chaotic streets of the dark city, leaving the blazing, violent destruction of the ruined harbor district far behind them in the rearview mirror. Inside the spacious, completely secure, climate-controlled cabin, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, profound exhaustion and an incredibly deep, overwhelming sense of absolute miraculous relief. Vincent Moretti sat entirely still in the plush leather seat, his large, deeply scarred hand firmly, completely wrapped around the incredibly fragile, severely bruised fingers of Natalia Rossi. The heavy, unforgiving silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was a deeply sacred, entirely restorative quiet that miraculously spoke absolute volumes after 7 incredibly long, agonizingly painful years of total, devastating separation. Natalia leaned her weary, battered head heavily against Vincent's broad, deeply protective shoulder, her eyes closed, desperately breathing in the incredibly familiar, heavily comforting scent of rain gunpowder and expensive cologne that completely defined the dangerous man she had never actually stopped loving. "I truly thought I had completely lost you forever," Vincent finally whispered softly into the dark, quiet space of the heavily armored vehicle, his deep, rumbling voice violently betraying the incredibly raw, utterly devastating emotional agony he had secretly carried for so many years. When that car violently exploded on that terrible Tuesday evening, I watched my entire world completely burn to absolute ashes right in front of my own eyes. I buried an empty hollow casket. I violently buried my own heart right alongside it. I became a completely ruthless, utterly merciless monster just to survive the crushing, absolutely suffocating weight of losing you. Natalia slowly opened her brilliant, completely striking green eyes, staring deeply out at the blurry, rain-streaked neon lights of the passing city. "I never ever wanted to intentionally hurt you, Vincent," she murmured quietly, her voice trembling with intense, absolute sincerity and deep, unresolved guilt. The explosion was heavily orchestrated by the Russian syndicate, but they possessed highly classified, extremely sensitive inside information. Someone deep inside your own trusted inner circle completely sold us out that night. I was violently thrown completely clear of the blast by sheer, absolute, miraculous luck. But when I woke up in the dark, dirty alleyway, heavily bleeding and completely terrified, I realized a terrifying, absolute truth. I was already highly pregnant with our beautiful daughter, Sophie. If I had publicly returned to you the unknown, highly dangerous traitor completely embedded within your own family would have absolutely never stopped hunting us. I had to completely disappear into the absolute shadows. I had to become a total ghost to ensure our innocent baby could safely live. Vincent's jaw tightened aggressively, his dark, completely unforgiving eyes narrowing into dangerous, lethal slits as the heavy-armored SUV smoothly pulled into the highly secure, heavily guarded underground parking garage of the luxurious Grand Plaza Hotel. "Who was the miserable traitor Natalia?" he asked coldly, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly pitch. "Give me his absolute name right now. Who violently forced you to live in absolute fear for 7 entirely agonizing years?" Natalia swallowed hard, her trembling hand squeezing his tightly. "It was Matteo Lombardi, your senior financial advisor. He personally leaked our highly secure safehouse location. And he was the exact same man who finally tracked me down yesterday, completely selling my current location directly to Carmine Bianchi for a massive, highly lucrative territory dispute." The heavy steel doors of the private, deeply secure elevator smoothly slid completely open as they reached the massive, luxurious penthouse suite. Vincent's mind was aggressively racing with incredibly dark, completely violent thoughts of total, absolute vengeance against Matteo Lombardi. But the absolute second the elevator doors parted, all thoughts of violent murder instantly vanished completely from his exhausted mind. Standing directly in the center of the massive, incredibly opulent living room, looking completely tiny and incredibly vulnerable against the highly expensive modern furniture, was little Sophie. The massive, deeply intimidating enforcer, Enzo, was sitting awkwardly on the plush white rug right next to her, gently holding a small glass of warm milk. The absolute second Sophie's striking green eyes locked onto the deeply bruised, heavily battered figure of her mother, she dropped the glass entirely, the warm milk violently spilling across the expensive rug. "Mommy!" Sophie violently shrieked loudly, her small, fragile voice completely breaking with intense, absolute, overwhelming joy. She desperately sprinted completely across the massive room, her tiny bare feet rapidly slapping against the polished hardwood floor. Natalia aggressively dropped entirely to her heavy, bruised knees, violently throwing her fragile arms completely open. She caught her beautiful crying daughter in a completely desperate, overwhelmingly fierce embrace, burying her tear-stained face deep into Sophie's dark, tangled hair. The sound of their combined, deeply emotional sobbing violently echoed throughout the massive, silent penthouse, completely shattering the hardened, icy exteriors of every single dangerous man currently standing in the room. Vincent stood completely paralyzed just inside the heavy doorway, watching his beautiful resurrected world desperately clinging to each other. A single heavy tear smoothly escaped his dark, unforgiving eyes, slowly rolling down his deeply scarred, battle-hardened cheek. He slowly walked forward, his heavy combat boots silent on the plush carpet, and gently wrapped his massive, heavily tattooed arms completely around both of them, pulling his entire, absolutely perfect family into a deeply protective, entirely unbreakable, incredibly powerful embrace. The incredibly beautiful, deeply emotional family reunion lasted for several heavily uninterrupted hours. Vincent personally carried a deeply exhausted, completely sleeping Sophie into the massive, highly secure guest bedroom, gently tucking the heavy, expensive silk blankets completely around her tiny, fragile shoulders. He stood entirely silently in the dark doorway for a long, profound moment, simply violently marveling at the incredibly peaceful, completely rhythmic rise and fall of her small chest. He had a beautiful daughter. He was an actual father. The absolutely terrifying, highly dangerous boss of the city's most powerful criminal syndicate had suddenly, completely unexpectedly discovered a profoundly deep, highly vulnerable reason to actively live rather than merely violently exist. He softly closed the heavy bedroom door and slowly walked back into the massive, softly illuminated living room. Natalia was sitting quietly on the plush sofa, having completely showered and changed into heavily oversized, deeply comfortable clothes provided by the hotel staff. Her terrible bruises were heavily treated, but the deep emotional scars clearly remained. She looked up completely as Vincent heavily approached, her striking green eyes completely filled with a highly complex mixture of intense, absolute love and deep, lingering anxiety. "She is completely safe, Natalia," Vincent whispered gently, softly, sitting down right beside her and gently pulling her deeply into his strong, highly protective embrace. "No one will ever violently kick down our heavy doors again. I absolutely swear this to you on my actual life." "What about Matteo Lombardi?" Natalia asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly with remembered terror. "He is highly dangerous, Vincent. He is incredibly smart, completely manipulative, and he actively commands a significant portion of your financial operations. If he currently realizes Carmine Bianchi is completely dead, he will violently strike at you directly." Vincent's deeply scarred face immediately hardened into a completely terrifying, absolutely unyielding mask of pure, absolute, calculated malice. The deeply loving, highly gentle father instantly vanished, completely seamlessly replaced by the incredibly dangerous, utterly merciless king of the violent underworld. "Matteo Lombardi is already a completely dead man walking," Vincent violently declared softly, his deep voice carrying an incredibly dark, totally absolute promise of complete, violent destruction. "He just does not actually know it quite yet." Vincent gently kissed Natalia's forehead, softly, stood up and briskly walked out into the highly secure penthouse hallway where Dominic was patiently waiting, heavily armed and completely alert. "Dominic!" Vincent barked sharply, and his tone completely leaving absolutely no room for any argument. "Where is Matteo Lombardi right now?" Dominic's heavily lined face darkened. "He is currently hosting a massive, highly exclusive private poker game at his heavily guarded luxury estate out in the wealthy northern suburbs. He thinks he is entirely untouchable, boss." "Get the men," Vincent ordered coldly, rapidly checking his heavy customized weapon. "We are going to forcefully pay our deeply trusted financial advisor an incredibly sudden, highly permanent visit. Tonight, we completely purge the absolute rot from our own family." The heavily armed, highly dangerous convoy of black SUVs violently descended upon the massive, luxurious Lombardi estate precisely at 3 o'clock in the morning. Vincent did not even bother with a heavily stealthy, highly quiet approach this time. He wanted the miserable traitor to feel absolute, complete, highly paralyzing terror. The heavy armored vehicles violently smashed directly through the expensive, highly decorative wrought iron front gates, aggressively tearing up the perfectly manicured, highly expensive front lawns. Vincent aggressively kicked the massive, highly ornate solid oak front doors completely open, his heavy assault rifle raised immediately, neutralizing the two terrified, heavily armed private guards stationed in the grand foyer with two precise, completely lethal shots. Dominic and the heavily armed tactical team aggressively flooded completely into the massive mansion, violently securing the lower floors with terrifying absolute efficiency. Vincent aggressively marched directly into the massive, highly smoky backgambling parlor. Matteo Lombardi, a deeply wealthy, slightly overweight man wearing a highly expensive, completely bespoke Italian suit, violently dropped his expensive crystal glass of scotch. The expensive amber liquid completely shattered loudly across the highly polished hardwood floor. His deeply arrogant face instantly completely drained of all absolute color, rapidly turning a sickly, deeply terrified shade of completely pale ash. Vincent Matteo squeaked loudly, his hands aggressively shaking violently as he desperately tried to slowly back away from the heavy gambling table. What is the complete meaning of this sudden violent intrusion? We are completely on the exactly same side. You violently sold my beautiful wife to the incredibly sadistic Bianchi family, Matteo. Vincent violently roared loudly, the terrifying, highly deafening sound of his absolute fury completely shaking the expensive crystal chandeliers hanging above them. You violently forced my deeply innocent daughter to live like a completely terrified rat, heavily hiding in the absolute dark shadows for 7 long, completely agonizing years. You completely betrayed the fundamental, absolute sacred oath of our entire family. Matteo violently fell to his heavy, completely terrified knees, aggressively sobbing loudly, completely begging for his miserable, pathetic life. Please, Vincent. I was heavily blackmailed. They possessed highly sensitive, absolutely destructive information. I will completely give you all my money. I will entirely leave the country tonight. Just please actively spare my life. Vincent slowly walked completely forward, his dark, deeply merciless eyes staring coldly, completely down at the absolutely pathetic, heavily crying, entirely miserable traitor, completely groveling violently at his heavy combat boots. He slowly, deliberately raised his highly customized, deeply heavy, perfectly lethal dark pistol directly toward Matteo's desperately sweating forehead. The absolute price of total unforgivable betrayal is incredibly steep, Matteo. Vincent whispered coldly, his deep voice heavily echoing with absolute terrifying finality. And your massive, highly impressive bank accounts absolutely cannot physically cover the heavy, devastating debt. Vincent fired exactly one single, extremely loud, completely perfect, heavily echoing shot. The heavy, absolutely massive, totally oppressive, violently dangerous storm outside finally completely actively broke as the early, highly bright, completely beautiful morning sun slowly, steadily began to rise heavily over the completely quiet, highly battered city. Vincent heavily returned safely to the deeply secure, incredibly quiet, absolutely peaceful penthouse. He completely stripped off his highly ruined, deeply blood-stained tactical gear and completely washed the heavy, dark sins of the incredibly violent, totally chaotic night entirely from his tired, heavily scarred hands. He walked entirely softly back into the massive, deeply peaceful guest bedroom. Natalia was completely awake, softly sitting gently on the very edge of the large, comfortable bed, deeply, highly lovingly stroking little Sophie's dark, totally messy hair. Vincent slowly sat heavily down right beside them, deeply pulling them both completely, incredibly safely into his highly protective, absolutely unyielding embrace. The violently dangerous, absolutely ruthless mafia boss had successfully, completely, brutally destroyed every single immediate threat to his highly beautiful, absolutely precious family. He had completely conquered the violently dark, highly deadly underground world. But as he completely looked deeply down into the beautiful, striking green eyes of the incredible woman he absolutely loved, and the tiny, deeply innocent child they had miraculously created, Vincent Moretti finally completely, totally understood that his absolutely greatest, most powerful, totally rewarding victory was simply finally completely coming home. If this gripping tale of a ruthless mafia boss discovering the daughter he never knew, he had kept you on the edge of your seat, there is so much more drama and revenge to come. Will Vincent be able to save the love of his life from his deadliest rivals, or is this a trap that will bring his empire crashing down? Don't miss a single thrilling twist in this true-to-life saga. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends who love a great story, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update.